Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Fiona Carswell tōku ingoa, kei manaaki whenua hau e mahi ana. I'm very relieved to not be contradicting my colleague, Colin Burke, and I'm delighted to stand in this session which is about complementarity. We've heard a lot today about land uses being complementary to each other, and I feel like I'm part of that same continuum. So it is my very great pleasure today to talk about natural regeneration on behalf of my colleagues, one of whom is in the audience. Natural regeneration is something I'm very passionate about because it is a wonder of nature and it really speaks to nature's ability to self-heal. I'd like to start with the very big picture of what is possible. And if you look just at the blue areas on the land, that is what we estimate is very likely or probable to be able to naturally regenerate. You'll note that that's over 3 million hectares. This is only land that's those land use classes 6, 7 and 8, which is marginal. It excludes areas already forested and it excludes land where the environmental factors are limiting. But here's the paradox. Between 1990 and 2016, we only gained 40,000 hectares of that, or 1% of the total potential. Nature actually regenerated 143,000 hectares over that time period, and humans removed 103,000. So what that tells you is that the current incentives do not promote this land use. Now, we're not suggesting for a minute that 3 million hectares should be naturally regenerated. We're not even suggesting that any entire individual landholding should be regenerated. We are simply saying that retiring the worst pieces of a farm can build a buffer into the working landscape. Delighted to hear Paul talking about Morgan Williams, because I think we've both been influenced by that vision of building resilience into working lands. So why does it matter? This is a very potent climate adaptation response. Forest-clad marginal lands provide erosion control benefits, biodiversity benefits, water purification, and to echo what Colin said, I think that it's really important to remember that landowners that choose to steward this process on a portion of their land report an enormous sense of well-being, satisfaction, and contribution to the solution. Now, you might have noticed on my previous slide that nearly all that blue area appears to be in the North Island. Well, today, all my pictures are from the South Island. So even in the South Island, there are hundreds of thousands of hectares where this is possible. You wouldn't think of the Clarence as an ideal location, but there you are. Parts of it are naturally regenerating, almost unhindered. So, it absolutely can't occur everywhere. Some places are really too hard. They are not going to turn into anything resembling even a short, stumpy forest at the sub-century timescale. Some places, like the Wither Hills there, can be coaxed into natural regeneration through vigorous herbivore control and a bit of extra patience. And then there are these other locations that are regenerating almost in spite of human intervention. So where are the good places? We've studied 10,000 sites across Aotearoa, and it definitely gets easier as the temperature gets warmer up to that point of 9 degrees centigrade, after which it's all much the same with respect to temperature. Local woody cover, as Colin talked about, is really essential. In fact, it is so important that it can overcome the temperature limitations. So this picture here in inland Otago is below that 9 degrees value, but there is so much kānuka on those hill slopes that it is all being pulled into naturally regenerating forest. Key message from me today, something also that Paul and Colin mentioned, is build on what's already happening, work with nature. I can say pretty confidently that it's not going to happen in these places. So, if it won't happen within a century, if ever. And so I think we really need to be honest about places that are not for natural regeneration. This probably can't carry a tall forest of any kind. These are erosion pavements on Denniston Plateau there. So where it does work well, it can be pretty fast. For stage 1, evidence that a site is primed for natural regeneration is those seedlings in the grassland. Those are kānuka seedlings in the grass. Where they're everywhere, your site's telling you it wants to naturally regenerate. From there's that really sort of messy grassland with bits and pieces of woody stuff, through to the short indigenous forest and onto tall indigenous forest. Those first 2 stages are much faster than most of the North Island, and this is a positive picture for some other places. Can be slightly optimistic. Now, we do think that you need those later successional species or the tall indigenous species in sometime in that grassland with woody biomass stage, or at the start at least by the short indigenous forest stage. And that's because they need to be established for when that short canopy starts to die back. It's relatively short-lived, it will die back in more or less an even age, and you need that next layer to be ready. So that could be an indication for help with planting, only if those big tall things are not all around and nearby ready to come into that succession. So, natural regeneration is definitely a bit like a game of snakes and ladders. There are plenty of snakes that can stall the succession, but also a number of ladders that can propel it forward to the next stage. To start with the snakes, problem weeds. That's Pinus contorta, absolutely has to be controlled, or else you're only getting Pinus contorta and more Pinus contorta. Fire has been mentioned already. Fire not only starts a succession back to 0, it actually changes a site. So it changes the conditions in favour of other fire-loving species. Gorse can be dormant in the seed bank for decades and then restarted and resprouted with fire. Browsing animals are mostly not your friend, and that includes stock and those wild animals, deer, goats and pigs in particular. Natural events, landslides, flooding, earthquakes can set it back, and spraying, whether deliberate or accidental. And the ladders. The main things are those favourable site conditions, that mild temperature, the local woody cover and the seed source. But I want to point out here that every few years you have this amazing set of coincident events. And so in this picture here, you have probably had a mast year or 2 for totara and beech. You've had just the right amount of rainfall, you've had the right conditions for germination, and herbivore density has been low enough to allow this event to occur. When you see that on a site, you can feel really confident that that is turning into a tall forest. That's beech and totara coming through kānuka and grey scrub. Gorse and broom are really interesting because they can be either snakes or ladders. We definitely think that broom's harder, but it might be because it tends to dominate harder sites. In our studies, we find that there's a whole life cycle of broom that occurs before native seedlings come into it, and then it's slower for native seedlings to occupy a significant part of the canopy. So again, I think there's a case for supplementary planting into broom. We now have a lot of places where we've put native seedlings in under a broom canopy. They've got really good survival rates, and they are sitting there waiting for when the broom gets really leggy and starts to open up. That's about that sort of 10, 12 years. And away it goes. We've turned full hill slopes into a native forest succession by having those seed islands, as David Bergen would say, in amongst the broom stands. So I'm going to go out there and say that planting is just as subject to snakes. So you can have mortality in your planting. Some of that is because of poor planting technique. We've all been involved with plantings that get invaded by horrible weeds. Fences, just as fallible there. Stock, wild animals getting in and browsing those. And of course, fire can burn planted things as well. In fact, I'm going to say that the messiness of natural regeneration actually confers a resilience to some of these snakes. On the right, you observe that typical mosaic that you get on a naturally regenerating site, loads of different species. And on the left, you see those charred upper flanks of Hinawai following fire in 2011. Now, it was a natural fire, it was caused by a lightning strike, but that top area there was all green again within about 4 years. The beauty of mixed species regeneration is that when they're generated naturally, they can weather hard years. So in 1 year, the conditions might not be right for one of those species, but something else will dominate and thrive. At Hinawai, the native plants that didn't burn and were on the edges of that burnt area, they recolonised it and took it forward faster than if it had remained in the gorse. The harder bits on the top, they've gone back through another gorse cycle. So it's clear that the right environmental conditions catalyse natural regeneration, but so too do the right social conditions. Morris White Native Forest Trust took a punt with 109 hectares at Hinawai in 1987 and installed Hugh Wilson as manager. While there were other dock reserves on Banks Peninsula at that time, the total protected area is over 6,000 hectares. Land managers gained confidence from the example of the Morris White Native Forest Trust. So the Trust's early example has kept going, such that now Banks Peninsula has so much natural seed source that the conditions are primed for the whole peninsula. The social and ecological catalysts have reinforced each other. And yesterday Matt spoke about the wonderful things that they're doing complementing this process on the peninsula there. Again, if you look just at those blue areas, that is the area that can now naturally regenerate as well, and is marginal for agriculture and not in forest already. So what are the active processes that the human stewards need to engage in? Exclusion of browsers, especially those deer, goats and pigs, and we heard yesterday about what a problem this is for us. Doing it together, as I suggested in the previous slide, definitely reduces the costs. Prevention of fire is essential as far as you can. You still get natural events. In my picture here, the only thing that's changed between the left and the right of the fence is the herbivore control. So it's mostly stock that's been removed, but they did a little bit of goat control on the right. At this stage, the possums are almost irrelevant, so it's those things on the ground that have to be controlled. You can potentially add tall canopy species to accelerate that final step to tall forest when necessary, and exclude problem weeds, and they're going to be different in different parts of the country. So to sum up, it is really messy, but when your site's primed to go through this process, it will get there with active management. It is not a passive process, it's an active management process. It needs to be stewarded. Look for the woody seedlings to tell you that that site wants to go back to it, and then you have to take all those actions. There's nothing passive about it. Build on what's naturally occurring, exclude fire and herbivores, and really enjoy every stage as it comes along. Celebrate the new things coming up in that forest. Ngā mihi mahana, koutou koutou.
Questions. Fiona, if farmers retire the worst of their land to regen, will they forever be dealing with spillover regen? Tips to overcome this so they aren't dissuaded.
This is where the quite hard browsing on the bits around the regenerating bit can manage that spillover.
Interesting. Next question. Is it time to put a ban on clearing native forest and scrub?
I think technically in law it is prevented, but as you can see, 103,000 hectares has still been removed.
Yeah, question here from Lindsay. There seems a climate paradox that we are striving to plant 1 billion trees, and yet we're taking down a million as well. And my Slido has just crashed, so I don't know what the end of that question is.
I mean, I'm going to have a guess on that, and I feel like it's not easy enough for people to do this, and so that's why that paradox exists. You know, Paul talked about markets determining land use. So at the moment, it needs to be easier to participate in this. It needs to be easier to access help for some of the real costs of doing this, and I don't think we want every individual having to measure every single tree on their land. You want to incentivise doing the right thing and stewarding at that bigger scale, and to take a collective approach to making that work.
Fiona, what fire prevention measures can be used?
So this is where you have to be really careful with people's access at a particular stage of that. Fire breaks, removing other incredibly fire-prone vegetation near to that thing, near to the regenerating stands. Of course it's hard, because it loves fire.
Fiona, have you seen any instances of natural regeneration being cleared to establish monoculture radiata?
Yes. Yep, there's a lot of that occurs, yes.
Do you have any ideas for how we could achieve large-scale predator and pest eradication to enable more natural regen?
So, I mean, there is a big push for predator-free 2050 currently, so you're seeing an unprecedented amount of resource into that. I think this is again where the collective is so important. So catchment groups, landowner groups together doing the predator control, the herbivore control. You don't need zero, you just need it to be knocked back to a level that it's not hampering the natural regeneration.
Awesome. That's all we've got time for. Thanks, Fiona.